Woodcraft, helping you make woodwork.
Process of removing, you're actually smoothing out the surface. It does take a bit longer to dry, so things can get in there. Hold on a second, I'm losing you here. But the process of applying it, you're left with a smoother surface without brush marks. Did you have a question, sir?
What do you do between coats on the
Question is what I do between coats. Typically nothing. It's all about building the finish up unless something settles into it. So if we're up to this point of actually putting on our top coats, my finishing schedule kind of is as follows. I put a coat on, I wait an hour. That's going to be dependent upon weather, if it's cold, if it's hot, if it's raining or not. Water-based finish, you can apply it while it's moist outside and it'll just take a little longer to dry. If you're doing a urethane or a lacquer, if it's raining, don't put finish on. It's going to blush. It absorbs moisture and it doesn't come out of the finish.
So you don't do any sanding? Right?
I don't unless something settles into it. If something settles into it, I will do a 320 or 400 grit, just a light scuff sanding. But other than that, I'm just trying to build everything up. I kind of do as many coats as I can during a day, about an hour, like I said, in between. It could be anywhere from 3 to a half dozen coats. Very next day, I do a scuff sanding, and a scuff sanding is using like a 320 or 400 grit paper, just dry. It's just a light sanding over the surface. The water-based finish, it kind of gives it a mechanical tooth for the next layer to grab onto. I do a full day of spraying again, anywhere 3 to 6 coats, and then the next day I do my first leveling, and I use 400 grit wet paper, wet dry paper, soaked in some water. Some people use oil. If you use oil, you got to clean that off before you go on to put more finish on there. Some people use soap, again, straight water, and I don't care if you're using water-based, oil-based, lacquer, shellac, any of them, just straight water. A little sanding block, mine's about 1.5 inches square of something that's not going to distort with water. Mine's a phenolic cube. You can use plexiglass, piece of rubber, sanding pad like this. And I have a couple towels with me and I sand, and what you're looking is to get a flat, dull surface. This is the point where you're going to start seeing, did you get all your grain filled in? Where your joints, where you thought you had a nice tight joint, where they start popping out at you, you get little pinholes in there, you can start seeing those. You might see low spots where you didn't sand perfectly. Not looking at this point to get a completely flat finish, just as flat as you feel comfortable. It takes a while to kind of learn your product. I know these very well. I've been using this high performance for about 8 years or more now. So I know what it looks like to get a nice thick coat without it running or dripping. So I can get a pretty flat finish fairly quickly. If you do have little pinholes, grain holes that are popping up on you, low spots, what I do is I make a note of that, whether it be mentally or on a picture or drawing or whatnot. I take a note of that, and I do a day of spraying. And at the end of the day, I try and do at least 3 coats per day. So at the end of the day, I will go back and I'll drop fill. And that's just a matter of taking a small paintbrush and some of the finish that you're using and dropping it on those low spots, and then just letting it be. When you come back the next day, you're going to be flat sanding again. You can work those back out. At that point, I move on to 600 grit wet dry. I do it wet. At this point, you're probably mostly flat, hopefully flat. If I'm satisfied with that, then I move on to my final top coats. I typically do at least 2 final top coats, and at that point you want it to dry. If you were doing a satin or a semi-gloss or a flat, you can do those as your final top coat. If you're doing gloss, just a couple more gloss coats on there. And then you got to let it cure. If it's not 100% cured and still soft, your finish will take a shine, but again, it can shrink down. It won't be as easy to polish out because it's not completely hard. 2 weeks with these, much longer with lacquer. When you get to that point that it's cured, we go back through and flat sand again. I call this finishing the finish, and this is strictly for gloss. If you have done your satin or semi-gloss and you're completely unhappy with it, you can't get a flat finish out of it, you can polish it out at that point and make a nice glossy surface. I go back through with 400 and 600. This one's going to take you the longest. Once you get there, all you're doing is kind of removing scratches. So I go 600, 800, and then I used to stop at 12 or 1500 and polish out, and I got a pretty good gloss out of it. I have since found with the water-based finish and going up to 2000 grit and then polishing out, it leaves you an even glossier finish. Again, just water with this. It's not the final. It'll be pretty glossy at this point, but not as glossy as it can be. From there, there's several products you can use. There's some hand rubbing products that we have here called like deluxing compound and buffing compound. You could go through the whole micro mesh gambit and just polish it out that way and be left with a nice glossy finish. I use a buffing arbor on my instruments with a dry compound on a slow speed buffer. Can be used the same way on an angle grinder or a hand buffer. Gotta be careful with those. They're great for big flat surfaces, but if you get to a corner, you can catch a corner very quickly, and the way finish works, it pulls away from corners, so you'll never have as much built there as you are on the rest of your surface. So you gotta be careful with that. You can also burn through a finish really fast. What might seem to be some milkiness, oh, I can buff that out, it's probably the finish heating up and it'll slough right off, and that sucks too. If at any point during, you had a question, yes?
If you get like a cloudiness, is that from overheating when you're buffing?
Okay, so cloudiness, if you have a cloudiness, if it wasn't there previously, then yes, you're probably heating it up and burning the finish. If it was there previously, it's probably moisture that's gotten into the finish because it was an extra humid or rainy day. And I don't have a humidity or temperature controlled spray booth. It would be really nice. They're very expensive. So if you're doing any sort of solvent-based finish, stay away from finishing in the rain. I will put on thin coats of the shellac, even if it's moist outside. They're really thin. I typically apply it by hand. I'm not too worried about that trapping moisture. Nitrocellulose on a flat surface, yeah.
And it looked fine.
Yeah.
Then when I went to start buffing it, then I got all this cloudiness in it.
The cloudiness, yeah.
Is that maybe in the spray itself because it was too hot out?
You know, I've not seen that. When I learned how to spray lacquer, the question still is about cloudiness when buffing lacquer in the heat. I learned in Arizona, and it was about 115 degrees, but it was dry. We didn't have any issues that I saw with that. It could be just overheating at that point. It's hard to say. Maybe you were overheating and it might have been kind of a humid day and then it's sucking in some moisture. It wasn't humid at all. Yeah, that's the only thing I can think of at this without seeing it, that it's probably just overheating the finish. Okay, yeah, so his comment on thin finish towards edges, so that shellac will build up a little better on the edges. Yeah, yeah, I've seen that as well. Yeah, yes?
Do you put water base over the shellac?
Water base over shellac, yes I do. Yeah, shellac is a great sanding sealer. It'll stick to about anything, and anything will pretty much stick to it. It's great if you're refinishing something that you don't want to strip down completely and you don't know what it is. You clean it up, give it a good sanding, give it a couple coats of shellac, and you can put just about whatever over the top. Yeah.
Are there no-nos as far as mixing oil and water base?
No-nos for mixing water and oil base. If it comes to stain, no. You can do oil-based stain under water-based finish. You can do water-based stain under oil finishes as long as they're dry. And I think General Finishes for their oil-based stains with a water-based top coat, I think it's like 48 hours or 72 hours, and then you're safe to go over the top. Not a problem. I know at least one person that uses a water-based finish and they actually use boiled linseed oil under it to make the grain pop. As long as it's dry, you should be perfectly fine. If you're concerned, do the linseed oil, let it dry, hit it with some shellac, and then your water-based top coat. Yes?
You're saying you can buff the water base like you buff the oil base?
You can buff oil base. Years ago, I did some tests of the Armor Seal with gloss, and I can get it every bit as shiny as lacquer or water-based finish. It just takes a long time because it takes so long to build and it takes so long to dry.
So I use the oil base right now. I go through maybe a quart a month.
Uh-huh.
But the
So will the water-based finish bring out the grain of the wood as compared to oil-based? No, not out of the can. Water-based does not. It doesn't enrich the wood at all. You can sand your wood out, you can scrape it, plane it, whatever you want to get a nice smooth finish, smooth surface. Build up the water base, and it'll pretty much look like your sanded wood with whatever sheen you want on it. So doing the boiled linseed oil or shellac, mixing a little amber tint into the water-based product is going to make that grain pop where it wouldn't out of the can, at least with this brand. Most water-based finishes are absolutely crystal clear. The Endurovar, which is made by General Finishes, it actually has tint in it, so it doesn't require anything to make the grain pop.
well, I didn't mean the physical. I meant the richness of the
Yeah, we're talking about the same thing. Richness of the wood, making the grain pop, giving it that nice amber hue that a solvent-based or oil-based finish that they naturally do. It will do the job better out of the can than the water-based finish. Yeah, this you have to do a little more stuff too. And speaking of that with the water-based finish, it's a little more finicky, or it has its own kind of deal that as opposed to an oil base or a lacquer, because there's so little solvents in here. Your time for putting this on so that the next layer will burn in is reduced quite a bit. If you did, let's say, a lacquer finish, I do all my spraying in a day, I come back the next day, I do more spraying, and then life happens, you got to wait several days, and you come back. The lacquer has so much solvent in it, shellac has so much solvent in it that the next layer will burn in no problem. Water-based won't. There are some things you can do. It will stick to itself, especially if you abrade the surface lightly, but if you go through and you level sand and polish, you might end up seeing layers. So what you can do is abrade the surface, clean it off, and hit it with some denatured alcohol, and that will kind of waken the finish back up so that the next layer, when you go to put it on, will really burn into it really nicely. So if you have to wait more than 24 hours before you apply your next coats, hitting it with the denatured alcohol is kind of a must for the next layers to burn onto it. At that point, you should hopefully have a really nice finish. I do have a couple other products up here, some steel wool and some synthetic steel wool. These are fantastic for oil-based finishes between coats, cleaning them up. I've used both. I'm kind of steering clear of the regular steel wool now, as it breaks down and